The winter of 1859 arrived early, and with it came a boy no one could properly describe without lowering their voice. Samuel Carter stood no taller than a scholar's desk, his hands ink, stained not from instruction, but from habit, as though the symbols of the world naturally bled into him. He was brought to the attention of the town, not by spectacle, but by accident, an overheard correction, a quietly rewritten equation left upon a slate after the master had gone. At first, they called it cleverness, then fortune. Then, when the boy began solving problems, the required instruments he had never seen and terminology not yet agreed upon, they called it impossible. Samuel never boasted, he listened. His dark eyes followed the movement of men who spoke around him as though they were repeating a lesson he had already endured once before. When asked how he knew such things, he hesitated, not from fear, but from the strain of choosing which truth would cause the least harm. Sometimes he answered incorrectly on purpose, as though protecting the room from what followed certainty. They tested him harder after that. Brass devices were assembled, clocks dismantled, numbers written until chalk dust hung in the air like fog. Samuel corrected them all, not arrogantly, precisely. When shown errors newly published in European journals, he frowned, then quietly explained why they would fail within decades. When pressed on how he could predict such outcomes, he fell silent, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table, as though holding himself in place. The discovery of Samuel Carter did not occur in a laboratory, nor under the scrutiny of men who believed themselves prepared for wonders. It happened quietly, almost shamefully, as such disruptions often do. In the winter months of 1859, knowledge was considered a thing that moved in straight lines from book to pupil, from Europe to the provinces, from white hands to darker ones only in fragments deemed appropriate. Samuel existed outside that geometry. His intelligence was not announced. It leaked. It seeped through cracks in routine, revealed by mistakes corrected without permission and truths spoken without understanding the danger of saying them aloud. He was first noticed not for brilliance, but for impropriety. A schoolmaster, irritated by the audacity of a child lingering after lessons, found his carefully prepared arithmetic slate altered overnight. Errors he had not known were errors were circled, amended, and annotated with a logic unfamiliar yet undeniably sound. The handwriting was small, restrained, almost apologetic. When Samuel was questioned, he did not deny it. He simply looked confused that the matter required discussion at all. To him, the correction was as natural as breathing. The outrage belonged entirely to the adults. What unsettled the town was not that the boy knew answers, but that he did not seek approval. Intelligence, when tolerated in someone like Samuel, was expected to perform, to dazzle briefly, then retreat into obedience. His did neither. He spoke only when necessary, and when he did, his words carried the weight of inevitability rather than ambition. He did not guess. He did not arrive at conclusions through visible struggle. He seemed to recall them. The men of learning who were summoned approached the matter with thinly veiled certainty. Fraud, mimicry, coincidence, these were comfortable explanations. A black child, after all, could not possess such capacity without theft. They searched for the source: a hidden tutor, a discarded book, a benevolent patron. None could be found. Samuel's upbringing offered no path to the ideas he expressed. He named principles not yet formalized, spoke of mechanical failures that would not be observed for years, and corrected terminology that was still being debated across oceans. This was the moment admiration curdled into fear. Intelligence that could be measured might be contained. Intelligence that defied origin threatened the structure, that defined who was permitted to know. Samuel's mind did not simply exceed expectations, it dissolved them. Each answer he gave widened a silence in the room, a growing awareness that science itself was being addressed as an inferior student. What made the discovery unbearable was Samuel's manner. He was not triumphant. He did not challenge. He often seemed tired, as though the world around him was repeating itself badly. When asked how he understood complex systems, he struggled to explain, resorting to metaphors that implied familiarity far beyond his years. He spoke of patterns the way one speaks of old roads worn smooth by long use. When pressed further, his voice would falter, not in fear, but in restraint, as though he had learned that speaking too clearly caused damage. The town began to watch him. Curiosity sharpened into surveillance. Every movement became evidence, every silence a provocation. He was paraded gently at first, shown to visitors as a marvel, a contradiction that could be safely admired so long as it remained unexplained. Yet the more he was observed, the less he behaved like a subject of study. He corrected the observers. He noticed inconsistencies in their instruments. He questioned assumptions that had not yet been named as such. The true discovery, then, was not Samuel himself, but the failure of the framework meant to contain him. Science relied on progression, on the idea that knowledge advanced step by step, guided by the proper hands. Samuel represented a collapse of that order. He was not ahead of his time in a heroic sense. He was misaligned with it, as though existing at a different angle altogether. By the time the town acknowledged that something unprecedented had occurred, it was already too late to retreat. Samuel Carter was no longer a boy who knew too much. He had become a problem that demanded resolution, an anomaly that threatened the authority of explanation itself. And the moment he was truly discovered was the moment the men around him realized that understanding him might require surrendering the certainty that had defined them all along. The decision to test Samuel Carter was presented as reasoned necessity, though it was born of unease rather than curiosity. Knowledge, when it behaves too freely, invites discipline. The men who gathered to examine him framed their intentions in the language of enlightenment, insisting that truth, once measured, would restore order. What they did not admit, even to themselves, was that they sought reassurance, that they wished to see the boy fail in a way that could be catalogued, dismissed, and forgotten. The first tests were gentle, almost indulgent. Questions drawn from familiar disciplines were posed as if to confirm a clever trick, rather than expose a miracle. Samuel answered them with a politeness that bordered on detachment. He did not rush, nor did he hesitate for effect. Each response arrived complete, without the scaffolding of thought that examiners expected to witness. This alone troubled them. Intelligence was supposed to show its labor, to reveal effort and struggle. Samuel's answers appeared without visible origin, as though they had been waiting patiently for the correct moment to be spoken. When the results defied expectation, the tone shifted. New materials were introduced. Foreign texts, complex devices, problems specifically designed to entrap rather than enlighten. The men took care to ensure that Samuel had never been exposed to such things, documenting his isolation meticulously, as though proof of ignorance might invalidate what followed. He was asked to read languages he could not possibly know. He did not rid them. He explained them. He corrected translations mid-sentence, noting ambiguities that scholars had debated for decades. It became impossible to ignore that Samuel was not solving problems so much as diagnosing them. When presented with experimental apparatus, he did not wait for instruction. He adjusted components instinctively, pointing out inefficiencies before they manifested. One observer recorded, with trembling hand, that the boy predicted the failure of a pressure seal moments before it burst, describing the stress as though he could feel it in his own bones. This was not knowledge as accumulation, it was knowledge as intimacy. The more rigorous the testing became, the less reliable the tools proved to be. Measuring instruments lost calibration. Clocks desynchronized. Results varied inexplicably when Samuel was present, stabilizing only when he was removed from the room. At first, these irregularities were attributed to faulty equipment or environmental interference. Yet the pattern persisted with unsettling consistency. It was as though the act of measuring, when turned upon Samuel, disrupted the very systems meant to observe him. Some of the men began to suspect deception of a different sort, not fraud but influence. They spoke in hushed tones of suggestion, of the boy exerting some subtle control over outcomes. Others dismissed this as superstition, clinging to the belief that all phenomena, however strange, must yield to proper scrutiny. Still, their notes betrayed them. Words like anomalous, unrepeatable, and unaccountable appeared with increasing frequency, scratched out and rewritten, as though repetition might tame them. Samuel himself grew quieter as the tests progressed. He answered when addressed, but no longer volunteered corrections. His gaze drifted from the apparatus to the men themselves, studying their reactions with an expression that suggested both pity and resignation. When asked directly how he arrived at his conclusions, he attempted once more to explain, speaking of structures underlying thought, of relationships that existed regardless of observation. His examiners dismissed these explanations as metaphor, unwilling to consider that the language of science might simply be inadequate. The turning point came when a problem was devised that relied on a principle not yet articulated. An intentional dead end meant to expose the limits of the boy's supposed insight. Samuel stared at the page for a long time, longer than anyone had seen him pause before. The room held its breath, anticipation curdling into triumph. At last, he looked up, not with confusion, but with something like sorrow. He explained that the problem was flawed, that its premise would not be recognized as such for many years, and that pursuing it would cost lives before its error was acknowledged. The silence that followed was not awe, but offense. To accept Samuel's answer would require admitting that the future itself had spoken through him, and that science, in its current form, was incomplete. This was a concession no one in the room was prepared to make. The tests did not cease after that moment. They intensified, but their purpose had shifted. They were no longer attempts to understand Samuel Carter. They were efforts to contain the implications of his existence, to force his knowledge into shapes that could be dismissed or destroyed. And in doing so, the men began to realize that what resisted them was not the boy's intellect, but the boundary of their own understanding. The silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in gradually, like a change in air pressure that no one notices until breathing becomes difficult. After weeks of relentless testing, Samuel Carter began to answer fewer questions, not out of defiance, but with a careful restraint that unsettled his observers more than any wrong response could have. At first, they assumed fatigue. Then fear. Neither explanation satisfied the evidence. Samuel was neither exhausted nor frightened. He was choosing absence. When asked a question that once would have drawn an immediate, precise reply, he now paused, his eyes unfocusing as though listening to something beyond the room. Sometimes he would offer a partial answer, stopping just short of completion, leaving a gap that begged to be filled. Other times he remained entirely silent, his stillness so complete it felt deliberate, almost instructional. The men began to realize that the silence itself was a response, though to what, they could not determine. More disturbing were the failures that accompanied it. Instruments that had already shown erratic behavior now refused to function altogether in Samuel's presence. Electrical experiments produced no reaction. Mechanical demonstrations stalled at critical moments. A chronometer, once used to mark the precise duration of Samuel's responses, stopped entirely, its hands frozen despite repeated winding. When removed from the room, it resumed as though nothing had occurred. These incidents were logged meticulously, yet no explanation survived scrutiny. The silence around Samuel seemed to extend outward, swallowing measurement and intention alike. Attempts were made to provoke him. New examiners, unfamiliar faces, harsher tones. They accused him of withholding knowledge, of playing some elaborate game. Samuel listened patiently, his expression unchanged. When finally pressed to explain his refusal, he spoke softly, choosing his words with care. He said that some answers did not wish to be spoken yet, and that forcing them caused harm. The room erupted in frustrated dismissal. Such language had no place in empirical inquiry. Still, the effect of his words lingered, an unwelcome suggestion that knowledge itself possessed agency. The silence began to infect the men studying him. Their conversations grew strained, punctuated by long pauses where confidence once reigned. Notes became shorter, less certain. Some entries were abandoned mid-sentence, the pen trailing off as though the writer had lost faith in language itself. One man confided, in a margin meant for calculations, that he no longer trusted the questions he was asking. Another crossed out an entire day's observations and wrote only that nothing meaningful had occurred. Though the page was crowded with data, Samuel's quiet seemed to reveal something deeply unsettling, that observation was not a neutral act. The harder they pushed for answers, the more elusive those answers became, not because Samuel resisted, but because the framework of inquiry itself began to falter. Experiments designed to extract truth instead exposed fragility. Hypotheses collapsed under their own assumptions. The silence was not emptiness, it was a mirror held up to the limitations of the men who demanded speech. At night, some claimed to hear faint sounds from the rooms where Samuel was kept, not voices, but something like the low hum of resonance, as though the air itself were remembering a vibration it had once known. Others reported dreams they could not shake, filled with diagrams that dissolved upon waking, leaving behind only a sense of having been corrected. No one spoke of these experiences openly. The silence had taught them caution. Samuel himself appeared unchanged, though closer observation revealed a subtle withdrawal. He spent long hours staring at nothing, his hands resting motionless in his lap. When spoken to casually, he responded politely, even kindly, but his earlier eagerness to clarify errors or improve designs was gone. It was as if he had learned that participation carried consequences, not for himself, but for those who listened. In withholding, he seemed to be protecting something fragile, though whether it was the future, the present, or the men before him remained unclear. The final and most troubling realization came when one examiner attempted to continue the tests in Samuel's absence, using recorded data to simulate his presence. The experiment failed in the same way it had before. The instruments faltered. The calculations unraveled. It became evident that whatever disrupted the process was not confined to the boy's physical proximity. The silence had taken root in the work itself, exposing flaws that could no longer be ignored. In trying to force Samuel Carter to speak, the men had encountered a boundary they could not cross, not because it was guarded, but because it was intrinsic to their own methods. And the more they pressed against it, the more they were forced to confront the possibility that some knowledge does not yield to demand, and that silence, when chosen, can be the most devastating answer of all obsession, announced itself under the guise of dedication, arriving softly enough that no one thought to bar the door. Among the men who studied Samuel Carter, One distinguished himself, not by brilliance, but by persistence, by the refusal to relinquish the problem when others began to retreat into doubt. Where his colleagues hesitated, he advanced. Where they recorded anomalies with growing discomfort, he rewrote them as invitations. He told himself that fear was merely ignorance unchallenged, and that the boy was not a warning but a threshold. At first, his interest appeared professional. He requested longer sessions, more controlled environments, stricter documentation. He argued that the failures of earlier tests stemmed from inconsistency, from too many hands and too many interpretations. Knowledge, he insisted, required solitude. Samuel was therefore separated from the others, placed under the supervision of this single mind, who believed himself uniquely equipped to endure what the boy represented. The arrangement was approved with relief. Responsibility, once centralized, allowed everyone else to sleep again. The man spoke to Samuel often, not always with questions. Sometimes he lectured, explaining theories in painstaking detail, watching the boy's face for signs of recognition. Sometimes he spoke of himself, of the years spent chasing understanding, only to find it receding with every discovery. Samuel listened as he always had, attentively but distantly, as though the words were echoes rather than revelations. When he corrected the man, he did so gently, never with the sharp precision that once embarrassed entire rooms. This restraint was misread as submission. Gradually, the boundaries of study eroded. Hours stretched. Notes were no longer shared. The man began sleeping near the room where Samuel was kept, claiming efficiency. He stopped recording failures, focusing only on moments where progress seemed possible. When instruments malfunctioned, he adjusted them without logging the change. When Samuel fell silent, he interpreted it not as refusal, but as challenge. The boy in his mind had become a puzzle that required sacrifice, and sacrifice, once justified, recognized no limit. What unsettled Samuel most was not confinement, but transformation. The man's questions changed in tone, less concerned with explanation than with extraction. He began asking what Samuel remembered before he learned to speak, before he learned to be careful. He asked whether knowledge had weight, whether it could be transferred, whether it left marks. When Samuel hesitated, the man grew animated, mistaking reluctance for concealment. He spoke of legacy, of discovery that would redefine the world, of truths too important to remain hidden. There were moments when the man's composure fractured. Late at night, his voice would drop, and he would confess doubts he would never write down. He admitted that he no longer trusted his own thoughts, that ideas arrived fully formed without effort, as though borrowed. He wondered aloud whether proximity to Samuel had altered him, whether understanding was contagious. These confessions were followed by renewed fervor, by the insistence that proximity must be increased, that immersion was the only path forward. Samuel watched this unraveling with a quiet grief that went largely unnoticed. He had seen this pattern before, though not in this place or time. Curiosity hardening into fixation, reverence curdling into possession. He tried once to warn the man, telling him that knowledge taken by force did not enlighten, but distorted. The man laughed, a sharp sound edged with desperation, and replied that distortion was merely truth seen from a new angle. The experiments crossed lines that had never been named. Sleep deprivation was justified as necessity. Isolation was framed as protection. The man began withholding food and light, not as punishment, but as variables. He spoke to Samuel of thresholds again, of doors that could not be opened politely. In his notes, now erratic and deeply personal, he wrote that understanding required intimacy, and intimacy required control. He no longer referred to Samuel by name, but by function, by implication, by what he might unlock. What the man failed to recognize was that obsession narrows perception. In focusing so intently on Samuel, he lost sight of himself, of the subtle changes that had overtaken his thinking. He dismissed the absence of progress as resistance, never considering that the boy's silence was not an obstacle but a boundary. Each attempt to cross it pushed him further from reason, further from the discipline he claimed to serve. By the time others intervened, drawn by rumors and irregularities too great to ignore, the man was unrecognizable, gaunt and fervent, insisting that he stood on the brink of revelation. Samuel sat quietly in the dimness, watching with the weary patience of someone who knows how such pursuits end, and the tragedy was not that the man would fail to understand him, but that in trying so desperately to possess knowledge that did not belong to him, he surrendered the very humanity that once made understanding possible. The realization did not arrive as revelation, but as erosion. It wore away certainty grain by grain, until what remained could no longer support denial. Those who returned to Samuel Carter, after the collapse of the obsessive inquiry, expected damage, trauma, confusion, perhaps a dulling of whatever gift had so disturbed them. Instead, they found continuity. Samuel was unchanged in the ways that mattered. And it was this constancy, set against the unraveling of everyone else, that made the truth unavoidable. They resumed their observations with caution bordering on reverence. Fewer questions were asked. Fewer assumptions were made. Yet even in restraint, patterns emerged that could not be explained by intellect alone. Samuel demonstrated awareness of outcomes that had not yet been initiated. He corrected plans before they were drafted. He responded to ideas still forming in the minds of others, answering thoughts that had not been voiced. This was not anticipation. It was recollection. The final experiments were less invasive, more contemplative, though still driven by the need to understand. Samuel was asked not how he solved problems, but what problem-solving meant to him. He spoke slowly, as if translating from a language that resisted time. He said that learning was not always forward-moving, that some knowledge was cyclical, returning when conditions allowed. He described truths that vanished and reappeared across centuries, not because they were lost, but because the world periodically forgot how to hear them. What unsettled the listeners most was his certainty that he was not exceptional. He insisted that what moved through him had done so before, through others whose names were never recorded or were erased. He spoke of minds as vessels rather than origins, of understanding as something that passed through history unevenly, settling briefly before moving on. When asked why it had chosen him, he shook his head. He said it had not chosen at all. He had simply been able to remember. The implications were intolerable. If Samuel was remembering rather than discovering, then knowledge did not belong to the present. It was not owned by progress, nor controlled by institutions. It existed independently, surfacing when structures weakened enough to let it through. Science, in this light, was not a ladder climbing toward truth, but a net attempting to catch fragments of something far older and far less obedient. Records were reviewed with new eyes. Past anomalies once dismissed as error took on disturbing coherence. Accounts of prodigies, sudden insights, inexplicable leaps forward. These were no longer isolated marvels, but echoes. Samuel fit into a pattern that stretched backward beyond documentation, suggesting a continuity that defied linear history. The realization dawned slowly, and then all at once Samuel Carter was not ahead of his time. He was out of alignment with it. This understanding brought no comfort. If Samuel was remembering, then forgetting was not failure but function. Civilization, it seemed, relied on selective amnesia to maintain its sense of advancement. Too much memory at once threatened coherence. The future depended, paradoxically, on ignorance. Samuel's presence disrupted this balance, not because he knew too much, but because he knew without context, without the comforting illusion of novelty. Those who grasped this truth found themselves at an impasse. To publicize Samuel's nature would invite attempts to exploit him again, driven by the same hunger that had already caused harm. To suppress it would require lies so vast they would reshape the very foundations of inquiry. In the end, a quieter solution was chosen. Samuel was released from study, his existence minimized, his records fragmented, and filed away under categories designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Samuel accepted this outcome without protest. He understood the rhythm of such decisions. Before leaving, he offered a final observation, spoken not as warning but as fact. He said that memory always returns, that what cannot be held will resurface elsewhere, in another mind, at another time. He said the world was not moving toward understanding, but circling it, drawing closer only when it allowed itself to forget what it believed it already knew. As he walked away from the place that had tried to contain him, those who watched felt an unfamiliar unease, the sense that something essential had passed through their grasp without ever belonging to them, and that the true cost of their encounter was not ignorance exposed, but the dawning awareness that humanity's greatest discoveries might not be inventions at all, but fleeting moments of remembrance slipping briefly through minds unprepared to carry them. Years later, when the ledgers had yellowed and the men who once argued over Samuel Carter had been reduced to names etched into stone, the world congratulated itself on its progress. New theories rose, hailed as unprecedented. Machines were built that echoed ideas once whispered in a quiet room in 1859. No one remembered where those first shapes of thought had come from. They believed discovery was theirs alone. Some nights, however, a few would wake with the uneasy sensation of having forgotten something vital. A formula would hover just beyond recall. A solution would feel familiar before vanishing. In distant places, children would occasionally speak with strange certainty, correcting adults without knowing why, then fall silent as though learning a lesson they could not explain. And somewhere beyond record or recognition, Samuel Carter's memory continued its long passage through time, waiting patiently for minds willing to listen without trying to own it, knowing that humanity would one day remember again, not because it had advanced far enough, but because it had forgotten enough to hear what always been there.